Good morning to everybody that has joined us this morning, and welcome to the Abilene Christian University Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action. Today's conference is on Christian White Supremacy, and we're going to be tackling several provocative and informative topics as we go throughout our time today. It's important that we take time to really understand what we're facing, and healthy analysis will allow us to lead into healthy problem-solving mechanisms and conversations. And so as we go into our time today, we want you to focus in to think through what our speakers are presenting on and take some good notes. On each of the different sessions, there will be time for Q&A at the end, but we're going to ask that you really listen in. So at the beginning of all these, we like to do a couple of housekeeping rules just so we can make it through our time together today. First and foremost, as you're going through your time today, if you have questions, please feel free to direct them directly to me so it doesn't interrupt our presenters and everybody else that's on the call. So on your little chat function, just go click and say Byron Martin privately, and it'll come to me, and I'll keep track of those as we go through our time today. We're going to ask that you keep your mics on mute. This is important because this will actually allow everybody to hear clearly and refrain from hearing the dogs, the cats, the microwaves, the cell phones, the traffic that goes by your house, or maybe the subway or metro that might be going past mine. So we're going to ask that you keep yours on mute so that we can make sure we hear everybody clearly. We are recording today, and this information will be available to you once we get through everything that is going on. All right? So with that, I want to open us up with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to shift it over to the founding director of the Carl Spain Center for Race Studies and Spiritual Action. So please pray with me. Most precious Heavenly God, we come to you at this time. Thank you for this day. Thank you for your many blessings and your kindness and your love. Thank you for being a God that loves us in spite of ourselves, in spite of our failures and our shortcomings. You still show up and love us, Lord, and we thank you so much for that. We come and ask that you bless this time today, Lord. We ask that you would allow us to think deeply and critically about this spiritual wickedness that we face, Lord. We ask that you move our hearts in a way that we can understand it and understand what you will have us to do in the face of it. We ask that you would guide our presenters and our leaders as they go throughout this time, Lord. Thank you for sending them to this space, and thank you for sending the minds and the voices that will be here today. Lord, we come asking for prayers on your servant, Dr. Jerry Taylor, as he's done so much to move this conversation forward, especially amongst your people. We pray that we humble ourselves and listen today so that we can receive what has been prepared. All these things we ask in Christ Jesus' name. Amen. I now hand it over to Dr. Jerry Taylor.
Thank you, Byron. We want to welcome everyone to the conference today. We are totally confident that God is aware of what is going on in his world. This is still his world. He has not exited the creation that he has brought about. He is still concerned about the affairs that are going on in our midst today. And we are very fortunate that he has brought us to this point, starting out the conference today with our Asian American brothers and sisters that will help us to understand life as they have lived it, which we all are part of the same humanity, but we need to slow down and listen to each other's stories of how we have all been impacted by the systems that have been constructed in a fallen world, and in particular, the system of white supremacy. And so we are grateful for our panel. We're grateful for Michael Ben Heist, who will be moderating the panel. And we're also excited about the additional panels that will follow this afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock and then at 3:15. And so we want to encourage everybody to have an open heart, to be receptive to the words that will come into our hearing today. These are words that come from the sacred place of believers that have wrestled with God and seeking to hear his voice. And so as we hear them speak, we must hear the voice of the Almighty speaking through them. And so the words that we hear, we must receive them with meekness and great receptivity. And so I will now turn it back over to Byron. And again, welcome to each of you as we go into this learning experience together with a humble heart. Thank you very much. Blessings to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for your phenomenal work that you began and that God has begun through you in a small place of Abilene, but it stretches across the world and across the globe. So we're definitely thankful for that. Without any further ado, we're going to move to our first panel this morning. Discipline by Race, Theological Ethics, and the Problem of Asian American Identity. We're going to tackle some things today from some vantage points that we haven't seen. And so it is with great excitement I get to turn it over to the panel leader, Michael Van Heist. I met Michael, I can't remember how many years ago, when he was a freshman on the campus of Abilene Christian University. And it's just so good to see the Lord still working through him in some powerful ways and in the ways there. I believe you're still in Nashville, right, Michael? And
Memphis.
So in Memphis, I'm sorry, Memphis, one of those places in Tennessee, but Memphis and doing some great work there. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael, who will introduce the rest of the panelists for this morning.
Thanks, Byron. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor and privilege to be with you in this virtual space. Again, my name is Michael Van Heist, and I currently reside in Memphis, Tennessee, and I will be the moderator for our time together. Before we move on to the panelists, I want to kind of frame our conversation for this morning. And I want to do that by way of a story. A few years ago, back when I was a naive undergrad Christian ministry major at Abilene Christian University, I was asked to participate on a panel about racial diversity. I can't remember the details exactly, but from what I can recall, the prompt of the panel implied that my voice, my lived experience, and my complicated particularity as a Korean American adoptee would be welcomed, expressed, and included. However, as the panel went on, question after question, comment after comment, it slowly dawned on me that my voice, my lived experience, my particularity was not welcomed at all. I was not asked a single question, nor was I directed to contribute to that conversation in any way. I was invisible. As this persisted, my agitation grew and grew until finally I voiced my outrage with tears streaming down my face as I asked the whole panel, what is the point in having a diversity panel when you aren't engaging the actual diversity represented at this table? And after a brief moment of awkward silence with eyes on the floor, one of the older panelists looked at me and said, not to be insensitive, my brother, but now you know how it feels. What is interesting about that statement, it's a presumption that I haven't experienced the sting of invisibility or perhaps racism more generally prior to that panel. So there's a particular ambivalence or uncertainty or discomfort whenever Asian Americans participate in conversations about racial justice. I mean, perhaps it's because we were we have bought into the lie that Asian Americans are those people who only have cultural identities, that we fundamentally see Asian Americans or Asian persons as simply those foreign souls to save on our annual mission trip we take twice a year. Or perhaps the discomfort or ambivalence comes up whenever you meet an Asian American who doesn't fit your idea of what an Asian American is supposed to be like. For instance, having an Asian American apply for a ministry position at your church, at a predominantly white or black church in the South. By the way, I haven't found one yet who would welcome me in, and I've been looking for 4 years. Maybe this ambivalence comes from the fact that we aren't taught to believe that Asian Americans have actual racialized identities who experience actual racism. Yet it seems to me that if we truly desire to undermine, destabilize, and eliminate the idolatry of white supremacy, then we must begin learning how white supremacy violates, tortures, limits, and renders invisible non-black persons of color. Failure to examine this cunning and sinister disease of white supremacy will entail the continued violation, restriction, and erasure of Asian American bodies within the body of Christ. Therefore, the primary aim of this panel is to render ourselves visible by sharing our own complicated narratives and inserting them into this conversation that is so often invisible in popular culture while virtually non-existent in churches of Christ. And with that, I just want to personally say on behalf of the panelists, a big thank you to Dr. Taylor for not only seeing us or hearing us, but actually doing something by providing us a platform to express our complicated pain, stories, and trauma. Before we begin, I just want to go ahead on behalf of the panelists to provide a couple of clarifications. First, this panel is not a representation of all Asian Americans in Churches of Christ, nor are we speaking on behalf of all Asian Americans or Asian persons. We are not a monolith. This panel is a representation of nuanced narratives that are complicated and demand our complete attention. So as you listen to these painful stories this morning, I invite you to pay attention not only to the similarities you might hear in each of the panelists' stories, but also perhaps more, and maybe just as important, pay attention to the differences and nuances of each. Secondly, we are not here this morning to play or compete in the oppression Olympics, right? In other words, testifying to our own racial trauma is not a passive-aggressive means to say our oppression is worse or better than other communities of color. That is not our intent. And if that is what you are thinking that's what we're doing this morning, then you most certainly need to repent. Oppression is oppression. Suffering is suffering. As far as I can tell, the way in which Jesus met all people is by giving each person he encountered equal dignity and presence. And so on behalf of the panelists, I ask that you do that for us today. So each panelist was asked to read Dr. Ki Joo Choi's book, Discipline by Race, Theological Ethics in the Problem of Asian American Identity. The intent of us using this book was to provide us with, the panelists, common language as we began thinking on how to share our stories. Because some of these terms are probably going to be unfamiliar with some of you, particularly those who are just jumping into this conversation about race and racial justice, we're going to provide you with in the Dropbox or in the Zoom box a bibliography and term sheet. Those definitions that we have provided will help guide some of the unfamiliar language that you might hear today in our conversations, and also gives you a starting point to begin engaging Asian American theology, literature, and ethics. Our schedule for today will be as follows. Shortly, I'm going to transition to Christine Yi Su, who's going to give us a brief history, Asian American history. Secondly, we will then move on to stories, starting with Dr. Samyang Kang Hamilton, and then we will move from each panelist from there. And then finally, we will end with some discussion, and we will hopefully have some questions from our audience. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just transition to Christine. So Christine.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. I am going to run through a brief history and some context on narratives that Asian Americans typically experience in our country. And so it's not a full history because we don't have the time for that this morning, but in your bibliography, you can see some books laid out there if you want to go further into knowing more. Asian American activist Yuri Kochiyama once said, "Unless we know ourselves and our history and other people and their history, there's really no way that we can really have positive interactions where there is real understanding." In our history books and within our educational system, like many other Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, Asian American history has often been diminished or erased. So as followers of Jesus, if we want to truly understand God's heart for justice today, understanding and hearing Asian American histories is a necessary first step. If we try to move forward without knowing our collective American history, we won't get far, because it's history that helps us to understand how we got to where we are today. To start off, I wanted to share two terms with you, two narratives or categories that Asians in this country experience. We are either viewed as the perpetual or forever foreigner, or the model minority, the perpetual foreigner or the model minority. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, a perpetual foreigner is someone who is constantly seen as someone who would never be able to belong in the US, or who could never belong, or who could never be born here. An example is being seen constantly as someone who is other. Someone asking me several weeks ago at the grocery store, "Do you speak English? Can you understand me?" Or asking me, "Where are you from?" And after answering Los Angeles, they ask again, "No, but where are you really from?" And I say, "Los Angeles." The term model minority is the false idea that Asians just naturally succeed and have somehow overcome racism through our hard work. This narrative of the model minority is often used to pit racial groups against one another. However, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, a third narrative and a more devastating, harrowing narrative from the past has resurfaced. Asian Americans have returned to being portrayed as the yellow peril, the yellow peril. Throughout American history, Asians have been labeled and used as political pawns, a very painful racialized narrative calling us a peril, a disease-ridden, dirty, dangerous group stealing from white America. In almost every decade of our country's history, there has been a law or policy that has negatively impacted the Asian community. In the 19th century, white nativists spread xenophobic propaganda about Chinese and cleanliness in San Francisco. And there's some images here that Michael will begin to share. Surges of racial hatred and discrimination fueled the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which kept all people from China from settling in the US. These xenophobic narratives led to hundreds of white men storming into LA's Chinatown and lynching 18 Chinese men in 1870, robbing and attacking almost everyone there. In the 1880s, 31 Chinese miners were slaughtered in the Snake River Massacre in the Northwest. A gang of white farmers and school kids robbed the miners, murdered and mutilated their bodies and threw them in the river. These are only two among many other incidents, but growing anti-Asian sentiment continued on into the next century. Korean farmers were attacked by white community members in California, and immigration laws were passed that further limited Asians from coming to the US. From 1910 to 1940, Asian immigrants coming to the US through Angel Island Immigration Station were indefinitely held and subject to quarantine and invasive medical examinations. In the 1940s, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order EO 9066, a policy which resulted in nearly 120,000 innocent Japanese American citizens, immigrants, and nationalists being forced out of their homes, businesses, and neighborhoods to live in concentration camps. In response to these traumatic events, there was a growing sentiment among Asian Americans to prove our ability to be the best Americans we could be, not to cause any issues, to be on our best behavior, serve in the army, keep your head down and work hard. Assimilate as much as you can, distance yourself from your Asian identity to become more American. And it was during this time in 1966 that the concept of Asian Americans as the model minority came onto the scene. This was a stark contrast to the yellow peril stereotype, where the media and government leaders suddenly began to praise Asians for their success in the States in spite of marginalization and discrimination. Asians were praised for our work ethic, our family values, our low crime and poverty rates. And at face value, these seemed like compliments, but you need to know the context. In the 1960s, this was right in the middle of the civil rights movement. As the Black community was making their experiences of oppression and racism known in a country that did not want to hear it, government leaders and the media used the model minority myth as a way to enforce anti-Blackness. Rather than acknowledge the truth of a country founded on institutionalized racism against Black bodies, the dominant voices in power pitted our two racial groups against one another. This seemingly harmless model minority myth was created at a very specific moment in time, used as a tool to uphold the system of white supremacy, and that is what it continues to do to this day. We always need to pay attention to the historical and social context. The racism that Asians are experiencing today in light of COVID-19, this is nothing new. This pandemic is expressing what has been there all along. Brian Stevenson, who oversees the Equal Justice Initiative, often says, we need to confront our country's history of racial injustice. We need to confront our country's history of racial injustice. Specifically in today's anti-Asian rhetoric, we see history repeating itself. Asians are no longer the convenient model minority. We are being portrayed as the problematic and disease-ridden, dangerous yellow peril. In the last few months, as the media and government continue to use terms that marginalize and blame Asians as dangerous and infectious, a group threatening America, with our president renaming coronavirus as the Chinese virus, or another government official calling this virus our Pearl Harbor, these are intentional strategies that racialize this pandemic. Using the terms Chinese coronavirus or foreign virus or Wuhan virus, this kind of rhetoric propels the public to see a global pandemic in racialized terms. These terms then begin to internalize and instigate blame, fear, hatred against Asians here and abroad. You might see these as small mistakes or not a big deal, but our words have power. Our words have power. Words are what shape our thinking. Words are what form our stories and narratives, and eventually lives and communities. Words create worlds and ideologies that we live by. Today's racially charged rhetoric against Asians is inviting the public to react to a global pandemic in ways that dehumanize and harm people who look like me. As Michael said earlier, an ache that Asians have often felt is that we are invisible to society. If you look through history books or the statistics of representation in media or leadership, our voices and contributions to society have often been diminished or silenced. However, in the past 6 months, as the devastating effects of COVID-19 have come crashing into our lives, Asians have suddenly been thrown into the limelight. We are dealing with a sudden hyper visibility. We are displayed on every media channel and news outlet. We are seen, yet we are still being silenced. We are not the ones telling our own stories. Faces and images of our community are being used to conjure up fear. I am one of hundreds and thousands of Asians right now who feel othered, isolated, afraid, uncertain of the treatment of our people. There is a growing sense that Americans' fear is intensifying into anger, not just towards those who are of Chinese descent, but towards anyone who is Asian. We are not the virus, we are human beings. As a pastor invested in anti-racism work and communal soul care, I have found that proximity is one of the main avenues that we experience transformation. When we become proximate to people we've only read about in the news and begin to see each other face to face, hear each other's stories, we're able to grow in our empathy and awaken our social consciousness. And we hope today that the proximity we share together allows us to grow in our ability to see one another as image bearers of God, to see one another as each other's keepers, as one another's neighbors. Thank you.
It looks like that she might be muted.
All right, is it working?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Christine. So now we're going to move into our story section. We're going to start with Dr. Samyang Kang Hamilton, who's in Abilene, Texas. And before she begins, each panelist, each person who's going to share their story with you this morning, were asked to answer just one question. How have you experienced racial trauma or racism in Churches of Christ? Dr. Hamilton?
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Before I start, and let me say how grateful I am to the Carl's Main Center for giving us a chance to share our Asian American experience today. Today is the first time in all my years at ACU for this kind of a conversation. And Michael asked us to share the story, how I have experienced racial trauma. The first things that come to mind revolve around having to change my identity in order to survive in my current context. I will explain later today why. Let me start from the beginning. And I'm from South Korea, and I grew up within a multi-religious environment with atheist parents who had a very critical view about religion. As a teenager, and I was also highly critical of religion. After high school, and I started to attend the church in my village. After several years of discerning and searching and praying and against the will of my parents and advice of my friends, I saw God's overarching plan for redeeming humanity. That drew me to decide to go to seminary to major in Bible and Christian education. After I finished my seminary education and I decided to come to the USA for further training and to learn more about our Christian faith, I spent a year at Oklahoma Christian University and then came to ACU to study for the Master of Religious Education. As a female and bicultural person, I took a Tamil Rice last Old Testament class at ACU. The class had about 30 males and only a few female students, but it raised for me a lot of questions about my future after I graduate. But I assured myself if I prepare well, God will put me where I can serve. After I graduated from ACU and I started my master's and doctorate studies at Columbia University, studying religious and family and community education. After getting my degrees, Mark started his at Harvard, and we lived 11 years in New England together. In 2000, we moved back to Texas for Mark to teach at ACU. Soon afterwards, and I began teaching as adjunct in the Graduate School of Theology. I have also served at University Church of Christ in the campus ministry and church education program. I served as a president of a Friends of ACU Library, and I'm still book review editor of a Restoration Quarterly. Mark and I came here because we are interested in Christian higher education and wanted to contribute to our tradition in the place where we begin our journey together. We also teach together both in seminars and in congregations and some ACU courses. Life has not always been easy in Abilene, Texas. Adjuncts, especially women adjuncts, in most universities receive a very low pay, and being a foreign woman is often a double strike against a person. Some people seem not to be used to respecting or listening to people who look and talk differently. The dominant culture in Texas emphasizes aggressive behavior and loudness, often at the expense of grace, justice, or solid thinking. My culture values good listening, reserve, respect, and careful thinking. Living out the values you are brought up in, which you value, it is hard. There are not many opportunities to share your values in this context. People in church always test you when you wish there could be some support. But at the same time, there are enough exceptions, often among other people whom our churches and communities push to the margins to make me to try to hold on. As an Asian person who is a professional, I would say that what I experience depends on the day and on the person I'm encountering. There is a difference between being an ordinary Asian American and a professional Asian American. There's no one way of being Asian American. There are many different ways we experience being the other. Always people remind you that you are in the minority. When I was younger, this outsider experience was hard. But in recent years, I have tried to think about how I can help my students who are in the same position I am. I came to Abilene in 1986. I was a graduate student. I was financially self-supporting and very poor. Kind people from ACU and the church community helped me financially in many ways. When I came back here with a professional degree and with this sort of job, our relationships were different. The status of you poor girl changed. People seemed to say, We helped you when you needed, but now you don't need my help. When people see you are educated and financially stable, they begin to see you as a competitor, not a potential friend. Some of our Korean friends told me they experienced the same thing. People talk about tolerance and integration, but at the dinner table, during our weekends, the segregation continues. By the time we returned in Abilene, I had thought deeply about my role as a Christian educator. So I proposed teaching multicultural education. The administration told me that it was not necessary to teach separate classes in engaging different cultures since everybody knew what multiculturalism was. They had it all worked out. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Pride and defensiveness were blinding people to the reality around them. When a few students complained about my accent, I received no support from administrators. They showed no awareness of experiences of the minority person as someone who is all alone and invisible. That is true for others as well. So our Asian colleagues silently leave this institution because of the insults of some students and then lack of understanding by the senior administrators, which we experience on a daily basis. So over the years, Mark and I tried to several ways to move things forward. For example, we taught an honors colloquium we call East Meets West. We found that our students knew very little about Asia. ACU has a no study abroad program in Asia and no faculty experts in Asian studies. So we are badly neglecting the education of our students with respect to most of a human race, since most human beings live in somewhere in Asia. Professionally, I think that the Christian institution is sometimes harder for minoritized people, it's hard to say, to survive in than a secular institution is. At the Christian university, people tended to be kind and tolerant about racial differences. But when it comes to making decisions behind the closed doors, the results are different. The kindness is not just the mask in many cases. People are driven by ideology and not seriously committed to practicing justice. Finally, I agree with what the book, Chess book, we are discussing mentioned. And when you say that we as Asian Americans are a silent, obscure group of people living in an in-between state, there is no authentic, normative Asian American culture. I feel I do not belong to any culture. I'm legally Asian American, but biologically Korean. I often say I am a citizen of God's kingdom. I have been thinking and living deeply into questions about who I am supposed to be as a citizen of that kingdom. Studies show that roughly 40% of Asian Americans report having personally experienced discrimination. But here's the good news. As the author of the book mentioned, if Asian Americans are neither fully Asian nor American, then Asian Americans are free to innovate their own sense of self. What it means to be Asian, American, or both. I agree with their statements. So I decided not to change my identity for survival and who I am created to be, live with the kingdom culture, not just Asian or American. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton, for sharing your story with us. We're going to move on to Tian Dang next, and he will be sharing his story.
Morning, everyone. Good to see everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tian Dang. I used to be a minister in the Church of Christ, no longer a minister there. I work with a justice and advocacy nonprofit. Because of my experiences, very passionate about highlighting the Asian American, like the complicated Asian American narratives. Michael, am I still seeing you? I'm sorry. Your face is just, is everyone seeing my face? Oh, okay. All right, cool. Yeah, so I work with the Justice and Advocacy nonprofit, have been involved at Fuller Seminary's Asian American Center, in which I've contributed articles to the center, also worked as a graduate research assistant, so I am a Fuller grad. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us. As I was thinking about this, like I was trying to figure out where to get started, but I guess I'll get started with like my experience first having become a Christian in the Church of Christ. When I found God at 18, I was brought to a Church of Christ. And I just thought it was church, right? Like this is how church is supposed to be. And it was there, like I'd always felt like I didn't belong in any space, like this perpetual foreigner. I always felt like an other. But when I walked into this space, that otherness became intensified because I remember feeling like I'd never seen so many white folks amassed in one space. And I remember telling a friend of mine, like I was on the second floor looking down, like it looks like snow down there. Like, what am I looking at? And so it was at that moment when I felt like, dude, like, am I in the right place? Mannerisms were different. The way we talked, like the way I carried myself, everything just felt so different. And that persisted through my experience in the Church of Christ. I joined the college group and people would give me nicknames like Ninja or Asian, which is funny because again, the college group was mostly white. They didn't refer to each other as a white guy or a white girl, right? But somehow they pointed out my otherness, my Asianness with these remarks. And so I didn't have the language to articulate what I was feeling at that time to make sense of my experience, because with the black-white binary, I just felt like, okay, it's not racism, right? We know that it's microaggression, but I was invalidating my own experience, which really internalized a lot more anger and hurt. And so that was a reminder that I didn't belong in that space. And I felt a lot of like otherness. Fast forward a little bit, I go to school to become a minister. I went to Harding University, and there the otherness became even more intense. There were hardly any Asian Americans. There were no Asian American professors. We did not learn Asian American theology. We learned theology, which is another way of saying white Western theology. But there, I remember a specific incident that was harrowing and so painful. One of the administrators had told us, like, we would go to different churches, small churches out in the country to preach, gain a little income and also experience. And one of the administrators said, hey, there's this church that's looking for preachers. Would you like to be on the rotation? Or would anybody like to be in the rotation? I raised my hand like, yeah, of course. 2 weeks later, he comes back and I'm like, hey, he comes into the lounge and I say, hey, so what's up with that church? Can we preach? I'm interested. And he said, well, here's the thing. I told them that we have people from China and Africa and Latin America, and asked them if it was okay for them to come preach. Why you would ask that, like, is baffling to begin with. At that time, I didn't know, I didn't think through it. I just thought, okay, that's weird. But I don't know why you would even ask that. But then his response was, which was even more startling. And then he said, they said no, they only want Caucasian ministers. This was back in 2015 or so. No, sorry, this was, I think, 2013 or so. And I thought, like, I was shocked. Like I didn't know how to respond at that time. I just thought, okay. And I came home and began sitting with it. Like I've dealt with racism all my life, microaggressions, otherness, and so forth. Model minority myth, which I was never able to relate to because I grew up in an impoverished neighborhood with, you know, a lot of Asian American gangs, no one rich, no one wealthy, but I sat with it and I thought, like, I thought these people were Christian. I'd only been a Christian for less than 5 years. So I was still a babe in Christ. And I thought these people were Christians. What's going on? Like, what is happening here? And I didn't know how to respond. I jumped on social media and just vaguely put, I was told I couldn't preach at a church because I'm not white, because they only wanted Caucasian, they only wanted white ministers. Like blatantly said that. The next day, people were giving me, you know, all sorts of empathetic remarks. The next day, someone from my program goes to the administrator instead of going to me, telling them what I said. And what ensued for me was even more traumatizing than the remark itself. And it was the administrators calling me into the office, questioning me, asking me, why am I saying something? Why am I making noise? What did I post? Why did I take it down? Why didn't I go directly to them? Right. Which was ironic because that colleague in my program didn't go to me, you know? And then I was just so angry and furious and said, like, look, this wouldn't fly in any secular organization. Why are we letting it fly now? And they said, well, we're Christian. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And so in that program it almost became like a white versus people of color thing. My white brothers were able to go and preach and make money and make experience while we couldn't, right? And then I get called in the office with the administrator saying, you know, we have the most diverse program, Tien. As if that makes up for, that's like saying I have a black friend, like I'm not racist. It was tokenism on a more collective level. And then they said, Asian Americans don't even face racism. And I'm thinking, what do you call this, right? Furthermore, a week ago, I was holding the door open for someone and they just laughed at me and called me Jackie Chan. Like, what? You have no idea. That was extremely traumatizing. That's when I first received the call from Dr. Jerry Taylor, who validated my experience. I just want to fast forward a little bit to this very seminal moment in time. I was a lead minister during the Trump administration, during the 2016 election, 27 years old, not knowing what I was doing, a minister in an all-white Church of Christ out in the Central Valley, a really conservative space. And it was there where I felt like this was during the election. I thought these people were supposed to be loving and accepting and communal oriented, compassionate. But it was there during the Trump election that people would make xenophobic remarks, like stuff like, you know, refugees shouldn't come here. We need to take care of our own people. They need to stay in their own country and deal with their own problems. And I remember feeling like these are remarks coming from Christians. Like, first of all, it's theologically unsound. But second of all, do you know that my parents were refugees? That a lot of my close friends and family are refugees, or were refugees. And I was hurt and angry. And I preached from a very angry place. And I reached out. I didn't know how to deal with this. I reached out to Black ministers who would talk about racism, to no avail. I didn't get any mentorship or guidance. I felt so alone. And I felt at that time like I'm not embraced by my white brothers and sisters, and I don't feel seen by my Black brothers and sisters. I'm not white enough and I'm not Black enough to be validated. Like, where do I belong? I felt unseen and unheard. And you don't know how exhausting it is to feel unseen and unheard. And when you don't feel unseen, when you don't feel seen, and when you don't feel heard, you begin to, you can't even see yourself or hear yourself. And you begin questioning your reality it felt like gaslighting on a grand scale. And so, yeah, the invalidation of the Asian American racialized experience is gaslighting on a grand scale. And it was painful. I went through a lot of depression at that time. But I was able to make sense of my experience. I felt like I'm from the hood, I'm tenacious, I'm gonna get through this. And so I Googled Asian American theologians and ministers. And to find someone who could understand, to find mentorship and community. And that's when I stumbled across the Asian American Center at Fuller. I stumbled across the director, Daniel Lee, who taught Asian American identity and ministry. It's funny, when I was interested in registering for the class, I was like, what's the point? I know what it means to be Asian American. I don't even work in an Asian American context. He's like, trust me, you're going to want to take that class. Little did I know, I did not know what it meant to be Asian American. And it was during that time, talking to Daniel Lee, when I finally felt heard and finally felt seen and finally felt validated. And that's where I acquired the language to make sense of my experience and felt like I was not alone. Like, there's language to describe my experience: perpetual foreigner, black and white binary, like model minority myth, you know what I mean? Like internalized racism. Like, I finally acquired the language to articulate and make sense of my experience, and finally felt seen, and finally felt like my reality was real. And from that moment on, I just started experiencing God's healing, but it's not been an easy journey at all. And I'm still working through a lot of the anger and hurt.
Thanks so much, Tien. There's so much I personally relate to that, particularly as it relates to applying to church ministry. Thank you for sharing your story. Christine?
Just finishing up my message to Tien right there. Thank you, Tien, just for your vulnerability and for speaking so much truth. I will share mine. Mine is manuscripted out, so I'll read it aloud to you all. But I hold these intersectionalities as a person of color and also as a woman, and so those nuances will be seen throughout what I'm sharing. All my life, I had been part of the Korean immigrant church that was reformed in denomination. So I was surrounded by leadership models where only men pastored and preached over adults. I had no problem with it at the time. It was what was taught and modeled around me, and the only way I knew. But during my senior year in college, I started to pay attention to my passion for ministry, for studying the Bible and theology, and I knew I wanted to give my life to God and gain tools to disciple and mentor others in the faith. When I told my parents 13 years ago that I wanted to go to seminary, it was initially a struggle convincing them. They were Korean immigrants who were also devoted Christians. It was a struggle convincing them to believe in my dream of a theological education. They asked me in Korean, 너 신학교 가서 뭐 하고 싶은데? What do you want to do after you get your degree? What is it that you want to do? I told them all I knew was that this was my next obedient step in my journey with God. In the months to come, they navigated untangling their own cultural expectations to trusting God, believing with me that God was birthing something within me. Looking back, if I had had the imagination for it, if some kind of paradigm had given me permission for it, I would have had an answer for their questions. What is it that you want to do after you go to seminary? I would have said with honesty, 나 목사님 되고 싶어, which is, I want to be a pastor. I want to be a pastor. After my seminary studies in Boston, I eventually worked at a Church of Christ institution for 6 years and pursued further education in spiritual formation and soul care for another 3 years while I was working. In these spaces, I found an outlet in my passion for ministry by overseeing student chaplains in our residential program. But it was glaringly apparent to me that no one who looked like me, the intersectionality I held as a person of color and as a woman, was in an official spiritual leadership role. When there became a rare opening in the chaplain's office, I met with my dean to talk through the potential of applying for the position. Over the years, I had worked hard to develop a thoughtful spiritual formation curriculum that other Christian institutions had taken notice of and were implementing across their campuses. I developed strong relationships across faculty and staff for a collaborative approach to developing our student leaders, and believed that this opportunity could be a next step to more intentionally pouring into the work I was passionate for. As I showed my dean a 2-page document that encapsulated a vision for spiritual formation in the chaplain's office, I will forever remember his words. After reading through my document, he said, "Christine, I just can't really see you in that role. I can't really see you in this role." I remember coming home that night with those words ringing in my mind and breaking down to my spouse, just feeling such deep defeat and sorrow. I know that the dean didn't intend to harm me, but these words caused violence for me as a Korean woman. It triggered memories of the many times throughout my life that someone had said or embodied behavior that told me, someone like you cannot be a spiritual leader. In my background in spiritual formation and soul care, we often ask the question, what is your image of God? What is your image of God? This question has been asked over the decades in spiritual formation to help people cultivate greater intimacy with God. I believe we all have an image of God that we cultivate in our lives. This image either looks like Jesus or strays further from God incarnate. If we believe God's waiting for us to screw up so that we can be punished, we become people who are unforgiving, judgmental, hateful, and scarce in our ability to give. If we believe that God is loving, ready, and willing to embrace us at any given point, even in the midst of our mess-ups, we become abundant people, overflowing in grace and compassion. Today, I want to say that at the same time, the same question, what is your image of God? What is your image of God cannot be separated from the physical depictions of God that many of us grew up with. Growing up, it was inconceivable to imagine God as a mother with feminine characteristics. Anyone who thought so was considered to have dangerous theology. In my Korean household growing up, we had images of a white Jesus praying over us at our dining table. At church, we read Bible stories filled with images of white children and white Bible characters, and read Christian history filled with white leaders, white heroes. The rare times I saw people of color represented in Christian materials were in subservient roles or as inferior recipients to a cause we could donate to. Like many, the Christianity I learned was deeply embedded in a hierarchy of racial superiority. White supremacy became ingrained in the way I understood the scriptures and Jesus. Most of my Christian education was reinforced with books written by white men centering white experiences, with the occasional optional reading section in the syllabus that sprinkled in a few voices of color. This internalized within me that my voice, my story, my people were optional. We could never be centered. In evangelical settings, I saw that people of color and their expressions of faith were tokenized or seen as unorthodox to the true teachings of the white church. Subconsciously, I learned to disembody myself, believing that I needed to lessen my identity, culture, gender, and ethnicity in order to better assimilate to this white male God. In many ways, it was due to the 2016 presidential election that I began to see the overt intermingling of white supremacy and Christianity in clearer ways. 81% of white evangelicals, along with 60% of white Catholics and 57% of white mainline Protestants, voted for Trump, a blatantly racist, homophobic, and sexist candidate. The last 4 years demands a reckoning within the Christian church for us to come to terms with the image of a white patriarchal God that we have discipled our congregations with, subconsciously or not. We have not dismantled the white slaveholder religion of our nation's past that continues to perpetuate violent systems of racialized terror against Black and brown communities. Research confirms that who we believe in heaven, a lot of us believe that it's a white God, influences our beliefs about who rules on earth. Our image of God has been so deeply co-opted by power that we cannot recognize our sin for what it is. If you ask me now, Christine, what is your image of God? I'm in the process of healing my mind, spirit, heart, and soul from colonistic and white supremacist teachings that have been internalized all of these years. I now understand my dean's response all those years ago when he said, I can't see you as a spiritual leader. I just can't see you in this role. I know his response is rooted in racist systems that discipled and shaped so many of us in believing that a spiritual leader, someone who is godly, could only be what we imagine God to be as a white male. Now it is healing for me to imagine God as a Korean woman, caring for her young. In many ways, my mother, who embodied the fiercest unconditional love for my sister and me under oppressive conditions as a Korean woman, has given me a glimpse of God. The image of God I am being discipled by and through is God incarnate, the Word made flesh, Jesus Christ, who relinquished power, who was on the outskirts of society, a peasant Palestinian teacher who would eventually be killed by those in power. His gospel liberated and empowered women. His gospel healed the marginalized and the oppressed. His gospel was for all people. As a global community of God, we must undo this notion of a white patriarchal God. The danger lies not that it represents God as a white male, but that it demands a singular narrative. It removes space for God to be anything other than a white male. I'm looking to seek and redeem historical images, artwork, writing, literature, scholarship, and research that reinterprets the image of God in all cultures and ethnicities as good and sacred. God is found in Kim Ki-chang's reimagined Korean Jesus and in Sophia Munson's Jesus as an indigenous Maori man with traditional face tattoo. God is found in activist Christina Cleveland's Search for the Black Madonna or James Cone's bold declaration of the Black Christ. We need to expand our understanding that God's very incarnation is a way of identifying with all people everywhere.
Thank you, Christine. I've realized that I'm watching the chat, and it makes me, watching everyone participate in the chat just makes me miss our live meetings where you would be getting a lot of amens and yeahs and come-ons from everyone. So I'm very missing this, so thank you so much. Zach, you're up next.
Yes, thank you. My name is Zachary Lubin. I'm the Youth and Family Minister for the Culver Palms Church of Christ. I also serve as an adjunct professor at Pepperdine. I teach an Old Testament class. I earned my Master of Divinity from both ACU and Pepperdine, and so it is good to be with you today. Dr. Shea writes this in his introduction to the book Disciplined by Race. Asian Americans as racialized beings is one fundamental thread that is woven through the diverse fabric of Asian American life. And identifying this thread and naming it for what it is merits long overdue theological reckoning. In my own experience, Dr. Shea's words ring true. And so I'm thankful for this opportunity to share along with my fellow panelists about my own experience. To be Asian American is both a fact I cannot change and a choice. And what I mean by this is, as a Korean adoptee who was adopted into a white family, I grew up passing as white. Kim Park Nelson, in her book, Invisible Asians, writes, for Korean adoptees, the ambiguity of Asian American racialization is compounded by racial ambiguity within adoptive families that use colorblindness to smooth over racial differences and conform to a normative construct of family that includes blood ties and physical resemblance between parents and children. And so I grew up identifying and thinking that I was white, which is very common for Korean adoptees. The most common racial slur I heard growing up was, "You're a banana," or "You are a Twinkie." That is white on the inside and yellow on the outside. And I must confess, as I prepared for this morning, I found myself remembering the many times my own internalized racism led me to distance myself from other Asians and my Asianness. And too often, this distancing included my own racist words and actions against myself and other Asians. And so I found myself wishing I could find the only other Asian kid from my private middle school in order to apologize to him for the hurt I am sure I caused him. I confess this because it was and is wrong. I also confess this because my own internalized racism is part of what it means for me to be Asian American, what it means for me to be a Korean adoptee. When I hear and when I heard the racist slurs of banana and Twinkie, I was reminded that no matter how hard I try to be white, I will always be an Asian American. For example, there was a time that I was being introduced after placing membership at a church, and the person introducing me stopped at my last name, looked at me, and then said, "I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly." The assumption being that my name must have a different pronunciation than it looks because of the way I look. There was the time that my wife, who is white, was told in a graduate program for marriage and family therapy by a professor that interracial marriages should not have children because they would not know how to culturally identify. I experienced life as a perpetual foreigner whose answer to the question, "Where are you from?" can never stop at California, but must always include my Korean ethnicity and often my adoption story. I remember in an elders meeting early on in my ministry career, I was asked if my lack of emotion was, quote, due to my Oriental upbringing, unquote. These and other experiences remind me that I am an Asian American, and with that comes assumptions about who I am and how I should act in America. But my identity as an Asian American is also a choice that I'm consciously making. I'm choosing to explore what being Asian American means by studying Asian American theology, learning more about Korean culture, and learning about the history of Asians in America, which Christine did such a great job this morning of summarizing. I'm choosing to no longer try and render my Asianness invisible. And I'm doing so because I feel the need to be able to help my 3.5-year-old son better understand what it means that his dad is a Korean adoptee and his mom is white. And this desire has increased more and more as we have lived through this pandemic, as a rhetoric that seeks to blame China has led to an increase in violence against Asians in America. And while I am not Chinese, I have been called a chink and a Jap enough in my life to realize that in many situations and in many people's eyes, it does not matter that I am Korean, only that I am Asian. I know that many of us here today on Zoom are from the Churches of Christ, and I am a lifelong member of our tradition and have been in full-time ministry for almost 13 years now. And so I do want to spend some time reflecting on what my experience in the Churches of Christ have been as an Asian American. I love the Churches of Christ. I am blessed to do ministry at Culver Palms. But over the last couple of years, I have begun to wonder what, if any, future do I have into the Churches of Christ as an Asian American. My lived experience is that there are not many Asian American ministers in the Churches of Christ, and that may be the product of the reality that there are not many Asian Americans in our tradition to begin with. I often go to Church of Christ youth ministry conferences where my attendance doubles the Asian American demographic. That is, if I am not the only one there. I once was asked why this mattered so much to me. It matters because as someone who has been minoritized in my adoptive country, being minoritized in my chosen church hurts. And I've had well-meaning friends through the years say things like, "Well, I don't see you as Asian," as if somehow that makes everything okay. It matters to me because growing up, I always felt like an outsider. And at the time, I could not tell you that a big reason for that was the color of my skin. But as an adult, I can. And I do not want my son to feel that. And so when I think about what might be next in my life as a minister, when I think about wanting to go into pulpit ministry, one of the questions my wife and I are asking when we look at churches is, will our son be the only one at church, in the neighborhood, and at school? If we move, what does that mean for him? There are some, and there have been some, who want to dismiss these questions, or at least question the importance, especially in church settings where often our impulse is to overestimate our ability to love each other well. But these questions are not rooted in paranoia or oversensitivity. Rather, they are rooted in my experience, and to dismiss them or to diminish them on some level feels like a dismissal of my experience as a racialized person. That this is the first that I am aware of panel discussion in the Churches of Christ on being Asian American only highlights the invisibility and lack of representation that I feel, which leads me to ask the questions about my future within our tradition. What is maybe most troubling is my sense that our country in general, and our churches specifically, are becoming less and less capable of listening to and for the nuances of each other's lives. And so the question moving forward is, are we going to be able to listen well enough to those who want to share their experience as Asian Americans? And let me be clear, I think this panel discussion has highlighted it will not be easy because the Asian American experience is complicated. It's complicated for me. This morning, though, does give me hope that we are able to and willing. I am thankful for the beginning of a discussion that is long overdue. So thank you to the Carl Spain Center and to Dr. Taylor for inviting me to come and speak. And thank you all for listening. May mercy, peace, and love be yours in abundance.
Thank you, Zach. That was really good. So now we are going to move into our question and answer section. And we would like to have our audience submit their questions, and so each panelist can take a stab at it. But as you guys are writing that, we also have some pre-written questions that we'll engage until for the meanwhile, as we wait for other questions. Okay. So after kind of listening to all of you, we are talking to not only academics and fellow professors, and we're also talking about ministers and activists and people involved in deep racial justice work. And so, how should our stories influence the ways in which racial justice work is done? I'm thinking specifically the South, where you don't have a lot of Asian American representation in Churches of Christ, especially in this part of the woods. So I guess what are some things you would like to say to ministers on this call who are involved in racial justice work? What are some things you want them to consider or think about? And anyone?
Step, we are very segregated community, especially I'm living in Abilene, it's the worst. So first step, I think, try to embody minorities in your church or community. Share their stories and see what they're going through daily basis. And I think, to me, that's first step. This is not about you have to write theology or, I accepted diversity, I accepted racial, justice. Act on something, one little step, and hearing a story. And that is the humility we call. And also, there's a lot of churches in here, they tried to include it like I'm not trying to critical, but we have two Hispanic ministry. And it's not about we are separated by language, but there's a lot of things we can see as a community, as a one, and honor, able to give this chance to share stories. I think that's the first things that I would recommend it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hamilton. I think that's good. For me personally, I think you can start by, if you don't have very many Asian American people in your life, discard everything you know about Asian Americans, like everything you've inherited. And it sounds radical, but seriously though, because everything you've probably inherited probably came from biased media or what you think you know, and then actively go out of your way, like you're doing now, to listen to stories, but also consume literature and art made by Asian Americans, because by doing so, we consume, or we're able to receive the very different, nuanced, complicated stories and perspectives of Asian Americans. That we're not one monolithic group, right? And so, listen to Asian music produced by Asian Americans, read works, theological works and so forth by Asian Americans, watch movies produced by Asian Americans. And we have a list that Michael provided of Asian American authors. But if you need more, then feel free to holler at any of us, and listen, right? And I think if you don't have very many Asian Americans in your life, then you would have to actively go out of your way. And it's not too difficult, but with social media, but it takes a lot of intentionality.
Yeah, I would echo Tien saying, depending on location in America, there may not be, and your church may not have the voices to elevate and to spotlight. And that's maybe just a reality of where you find yourself. But there are theologians and thinkers who are writing, especially now, that, again, don't speak for the entire Asian American community, but it is a place to begin. I know for myself, that was part of the process of becoming more aware, and trying to be able to put words to my experience. Christine did a wonderful job in her talking about how our educational experience leans heavily to Western European history and theology, especially those of us who have gone through seminary and have done undergraduate degrees in religion. And I expect, my assumption, I could be wrong, but most of our current reading as ministers probably leans that same way, because that's who we were taught to read and think about. And so we are missing wonderful conversations, missing wonderful insights that can come and benefit our ministries. And so it would be a blessing, I think, for your church to start reading Asian American theologians. Something that
I think that hearing stories is very important and relevant to even what we're doing here today. But I think the systems that exist right now that continue to perpetuate narratives about Asian Americans is problematic. And it's little things for me. We've had fires here 10 minutes from where I live, and thankfully they've subsided. But for a while, maybe for a 2-week period, we couldn't go out. And it reminded me of how I felt at the beginning of this pandemic, when it was just hard to go outside because I was afraid of harm, of people harming me or my children. Because every time I would go to the grocery store, I would, and I'm in California, which is considered a more liberal or progressive place or more diverse space. But just that the glaring of eye contact or yelling out at me, from the car, derogatory names. And so yesterday I went outside for the first time, and I hadn't been out in so long. And I passed someone who was white on the street, and I automatically flinched. It just was this, I'm in this perpetual state of fear right now. So I'm processing real time as I'm talking to you all. So thank you for bearing with me. But I think just there needs to be change in the way that we share stories from a dominant space, from people in power, and not to manipulate or spin stories so that more and more people of color are dehumanized. One thing I wanted to also share was what I talked about in what I shared earlier, just images that we are perpetuating in churches I served at a multi-ethnic church for the past 4 years as a pastor of spiritual formation, and it's a very multi-ethnic church. But even the curriculum that we had was still images of white children and white. So it's like my daughter kept drawing herself as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. Every time I would say, "Draw yourself, Ellie," she would draw herself as white with blue eyes and blonde hair. And these are images that, you know, she was intaking from the church and from everywhere else. But I believe that as the church, we can be more intentional and shape the generations behind us, and even now to cultivate a love for our own culture as Asian Americans.
Thank you, everyone. I have a couple more questions before we move to audience questions, if that's all right, Byron. So each of our panelists have shared very painful wounds and trauma. So I'm really curious about, you know, what are the ways in which you have engaged healing? What has been your healing process? Or what are the specific healing practices that you are doing, and how, and if you're talking to pastors on this call, what would you tell them? How would you tell them to pastor someone like me, who was a Korean adoptee, who might be going through an existential crisis at any moment about his or her adoption? So what would you like to, how would you advise that minister to pastor them or heal them? Yeah, pastor, sorry.
I think what can be difficult at times is, as ministers, as pastors, we feel like we have to provide an answer. And there's always been a power dynamic in our country, is, you know, what our talk is about today, white supremacist teaching and thinking, so that sometimes people who are in the white community believe that they have the answer to give to someone who is Asian and experiencing marginalization. And so I would hope, Michael, in response to your question, that people listening in would hear you say your question and say, if I have a congregant who is experiencing existential crisis about their Asian American identity, it would begin a journey to look inward and to wonder, how have I perpetuated, how have I been complicit in harming my congregant in narratives that are unhealthy or steeped in stereotypes. And I would hope that this pastor or minister would begin to read and research for themselves without burdening the congregant to say, teach me what you know, because that is not on you to share. It would be on the person who is listening in to say, hey, I really care. I need to Google. Google is right at my fingertips. Asian American congregant struggling. How can I help? What are books, theological books, biblical books on racial reconciliation for the Asian American community? You know, just begin this journey to be able to support you without burdening you to be an educator or to speak for your whole community.
One of the things that I have found helpful as a minister, as I read some Asian American theologians, was this concept of Han, this idea that there is trauma and woundedness. It's a Korean term that talks to sort of unresolved trauma that is inflicted and then can become generational. And that has expanded my view that too often in churches we limit our conversation about healing to this idea of sin and justification. And we don't do a great job of talking about the sinned against and the wounds. And so as a minister, when I listen, one of the things I'm working against is trying to attribute this situation to someone's sin, to individualize that, but then to recognize that there are better theological categories to understand the woundedness of Asian Americans, to understand the woundedness of racial trauma. And so I would challenge us as ministers to expand our theological categories in a way that we can approach those situations better able to listen to those who are expressing their hurt.
Yeah, and I echo a lot of what Christine and Zach are saying. For me, I think we don't have to overcomplicate things, right? Telling a person that you see them, that you hear them, does wonders. Validating their experiences, and then just following up with like, tell me more. Allowing someone to share their stories, because it's in the processing that we can also find healing, right? Being able to articulate exactly what we're feeling. Maybe we might not have the technical language to make sense of it fully, but like just being able to process, I feel like, is healing in and of itself. But also realize that like you're not the Messiah, and that you can't do it all. And so sometimes you have to refer people to others. So if you have Asian American, if you know Asian American ministers or theologians or whomever, connecting your Asian American congregants to that person so that they can like relate to them, because it's a totally different experience. For me, when I was the lead minister in the church in the Central Valley, and I was experiencing all this otherness, I went to white mentors in the church to try to find solace and healing, and it never went well, because I always felt like my experiences were invalidated. Like people saying, why are you angry? They're just making these comments about refugees because it's just what they know. But they're imperfect humans, but they didn't realize the weight, the gravity of xenophobic remarks. And so I feel like referring people to Asian American thinkers is a huge help.
I'm a Christian educator, and I always think about where we go from here, the questions. How are we going to sort it out, all these problems and pains and sufferings, racial issue, gender issue, especially Christian community is not doing what they're supposed to. And personally, I said our Christian education failed. It's not God's part, but as a human effort, we fail. And I serve as a chair of a teaching committee and education program. I try to bring all those issues. Bible talk about this issue more appropriate than the way we interpret it. The Towers of Babel, and they think diversity is a curse, right? But it was blessing. And this is the way how humans are supposed to live with the diversity as a strength. The way we interpret it so long backward. So to me, as a Christian educational perspective, and church needed to not change the systematically how we educated. Bible classes need to be changed system. And ministers by engaged in what are really doing. Why Christians stand up a racial prejudice supporting them? And we need to think about it. And churches, people should be nice to African American next door to you, give you a hug. And then socially, politically, they're supporting something else. What is it? Why is it happening? And so family, church, we need to focus on restructure our educational program is one way to go. Personally, I try to do the ACU community. I sometimes try to for minority students, personally, but church is not doing what we're supposed to do. So let's try to focus on church, what we can do. Some of the ministers are listening this one, and we need to look into educational system. What is we really? Bible only? About what? Bible talk about a lot of things we avoided. No curriculum. We tended to skip those things, not want to talk about the things. What are those things we are wanted to talk about? So let's go. Let's start at just a little step. It's not something. We can change the whole system, right? And first step. What are those first step to go? Sorry to preaching.
No, that's great. That's really great. Thank you for that. Preach on. Third question. You know, there's this scene in the book that Dr. Choi writes about, and I might get the details wrong, but here's the gist of it. There was a narrative account about an Asian American going to support a Black Lives Matter protest, and an African American seeing that Asian American and basically saying, "What are you doing here? Get out of here!" and like surrounding this Asian American person, where that person felt threatened, right? And so they jetted on out of there. So a block down the road, this Asian American person meets another group of Black Lives Matter supporters, and they said, "Come on, come join us. You're one of us. You're a person of color," right? So my question is, what does cross-racial solidarity look like?
I can start with this one. I think those two incidences highlight how complicated this is, right? Like the racial dialogue, and also highlights the white-black binary. One group saying you're not us, the other saying, hey, you're welcome, you know, you're us. I think cross-cultural solidarity starts with knowing our stories. Like what Christine shared is absolutely imperative. And Asian Americans have to know our stories as well. When we don't know our stories, we don't know how we've been harmed and also manipulated by white supremacy. And so we don't know where we're situated in this whole dominant narrative, in this whole grand narrative, right? Us and our communities of color don't know where we stand as well. So I think it starts with knowing our stories, and realizing that we've been harmed, and also realizing that we've been complicit as well in our own ways, right? Being victims of internalized racism and colonial mentality. And so it starts there. It starts there because Asian Americans are not allies to the Black community. We are co-laborers, right? And so to allies can connote like, hey, we've somehow been free from the harms of white supremacy, that we are the model minority. And so we're co-laborers, co-strugglers. And so starting there, and then using that in-betweenness, that space, that liminality that Che talks about, that Dr. Lee in his book From a Liminal Place talked about, like standing in that space of in-betweenness where we neither belong here nor there, and embracing that space as a creative potential to advocate on behalf of others and to advocate alongside others as well. So I think we can get started there, is knowing our stories, other folks knowing our stories, and simply refusing the oppression Olympics narrative, rejecting the model minority, admitting our complicity as well, and simply standing alongside and co-laboring.
For me, I lived half in America and half Korea, and we grow up as a Korean is a poor blood, not mixed with any other culture. I'm very proud of that purity about blood related. And you come to US and very group oriented, values of group oriented society coming, an individualistic society, and have a voice. It's hard sometimes. And also, so we need to learn about how treated as a human being beside you. So you're individually acting out as is not simple for people coming from Asia in general, in my opinion. So as Asians ourselves, we have some problems here. And we are stereotypes about Americans have, white Americans have. We have so honorary whites, invisible person, middle minority, and middle Asian minorities, bystanders to the black-white tug-of-war ping pong ball. And some people, Asians next in line to be white. And that stereotypes we have, we need to, I think it represents all of Asians with that category in many ways. And I think we need to sort it out. Who are we as a cultural person? And this is kind of an Asian American community needed to work on these issues. And also some other community work with other communities to solve these issues. But so this gender racial issues is not one-sided. We all work together. Otherwise, we're never going to solve anything. We're not able to go anywhere. So worrying about ourselves internally, and also how we can work with other community and work together. To me, that's one step of a solution to me.
Zach or Christine, do you have anything to add to this question, or are we good? I just got sent a text message with some of our from our audience, and so I'm going to go ahead and move on to audience questions, if that's all right with y'all. I'm just gonna. I've not read these, so I'm gonna read them out loud right now. So here we go. This is from Tamara Turner. Is there a sense within the Asian panelists that the length and depth of the torment of chattel, CHATTEL slavery, and our existence in the Americas as involuntary, juxtaposed to all other people of color as being unique, is that concept offensive, hurtful? Is there a way this can be articulated to unify all people of color? It seems if this is not well articulated, it will automatically begin to put us against each other. This may be why the moderator addressed the oppression Olympics at the outset. Selfishly and myopically, it feels a bit dismissive to say oppression is oppression without acknowledging that what, say, our Jewish brothers and sisters have gone through is dramatically different in length, depth of extended torture and outcomes to what foundational Black Americans have and still experiencing will itself be a tool of Satan to divide us. Is there a way to acknowledge both or all with the basic historic perspective that caste is based on closer to lighter skin is higher up?
I hope I'm answering the question, but I do believe that anti-Blackness exists in all communities. And so within the Asian community, one just off my head topic is we have skin whitening creams that Korean skincare, it's a big thing right now, but we have these skin whitening creams, and it's really been recently that I've had to undo that. It's been ingrained in me since I was a child, like, don't get dark because you're gonna get burned outside, and don't get, like, this mentality of darkness is bad. And so there's anti-Blackness in my community, in Korean community, that I need to uproot. And that's just one example, but I do believe that we cannot compare oppression, but I do believe that our oppressions bring us together. And Asians stand in this middle minority space where we have so much proximity to whiteness, and we gain from that. And I want to own that. Yet at the same time, this is why what Tien said earlier is so important. We need to know our history to locate ourselves socially and realize white supremacy is out to get us at any given point. We can be the model minority one moment, and at the flip of a switch, we are the yellow peril. And so this is the work, to educate ourselves, to educate the people that we love around us, and to continually be in this work of racial reconciliation. And I do believe it is one of the fruit of the Spirit, that long suffering that exists in this work is part of our call as followers of Jesus.
I think there needs to be, it's the hard work of having the conversations between the African American community and the Asian American community. And it's going to take some honesty and some willingness to confess. I so appreciate Christine bringing up the fact that there is in the Korean American community anti-Blackness. And that's something that our community, that's something that I personally need to confess and have conversations with my friends who are African American and talk about that. I don't know I don't know, again, speaking only for myself, I can only start that work with the people that I know, and have those conversations. But I think for us to work against this myth of white supremacy, we do need to have those conversations, and not to be dismissive and not to play the game of comparison, but to really listen to each other, validate each other, and then work creatively to talk about ways that we can support each other. And that takes listening and speaking and being able to be long-suffering with each other, like Christine said.
Agree with all the powerful things our fellow panelists have shared. Just one thing to add is that anti-Blackness is fundamentally rooted in colonialism. Colonizers who've invaded our countries, our indigenous lands, and implanted colonial beliefs that lighter skin, fairer skin is ideal, right? And colonialism is so pernicious and so harmful that it perpetrated the Indochina Wars in Southeast Asia. So the Vietnam War fundamentally rooted in colonialism because people wanting to resist white hegemony. And this was so harmful that during the last Indochina War, the Cambodian people, the Khmer Rouge, killed 1/3 of the Cambodian population because they wanted to eradicate anything resembling whiteness or Westernism, right? And so this stuff is fundamentally rooted in colonialism. So anti-Blackness, so real and so painful, but rooted in white supremacy, right? And so there's this common enemy that we all have right here, is this system, this ideal of beliefs.
Dr. Hamilton, I don't want to move on to another question unless you have some before asking if you had anything to add on to what has been said.
I think I already shared. The Asian Americans is not innocent victims only, and we are the contributors also. And that's why I said we are not prepared, especially coming from first generations did not prepare for how to treat other people, especially when I'm growing up and we are scared about African Americans. And, that kind of mentality, they come in here, they're still doing it. We hear the story, California, those 1900, the middle of during that time, conflicts there. So we are not innocent. And so we need to work together. That's all. Already they talk about it. So let's work together. We are not only suffering and victims. Time to work together and learn the story, learn the history, and share the stories. Let's go from here. What we need to contribute to something. And that way we heal. And we work together. This is a healing process to me.
Christine, were you about to jump in?
Yes, and I really appreciate, Dr. Hamilton, that you brought up the 92 LA uprising, because I think that was one of the catapults within the Korean community to see the flipping of the switch that we just talked about happen so quickly. And a lot of times when dominant media shares that story, they don't mention that there was a Korean store owner named Sun Ja-dun that murdered Latasha Harlins, a young African-American girl. She thought Latasha was stealing something, but she wasn't, and I believe probably many of us in this call don't know Latasha's name, and we need to say her name because the dominant media spinned it so that it just pit our racial groups against one another. And so that's why it's the systems that we have to attack and say it's not just about hearing one another's stories. That's one layer of it, but it's the systems of white supremacy that continue to perpetuate narratives that pit our groups, our racial groups against one another, when instead it's the solidarity that overcomes the supremacy.
Thank y'all. We have about 10 more minutes left. I'm going to ask a couple more questions from the audience, and then I'll turn it back over to Byron. Gregory McNair asked, how can we prepare the hearts of people to hear the stories in a way that will change perception and behavior?
Pray for the Holy Spirit to move in people's lives and work on the hearts. Like, as a minister, the longer I've done ministry, the more I realize I cannot control the people I'm ministering to. I cannot force people to hear what I think God is trying to say. And there's humility in that that comes from it. So I think pray. I think, again, modeling it in your own life is probably a great place to start as well. But it's, I mean, all of this and the conversation, I think, for all of us as panelists, is couched in a lot of prayer and trying to be open to the Spirit.
I think it takes a lot of ownership of one's own lack of education in a certain area of race and equity. And I mean, that's how it has been for me. I think we create space for people to want to learn and hear stories that are different from theirs when we model it to our congregants, model it to our family members, when we model it to our children. It's just that congruency piece when it becomes about performative allyship, when it's like, oh, I'm doing this thing because I don't want to look bad. That's different from going inward internally. What are ways that I have caused harm? What are ways that I've been violent? What are ways that I have perpetuated stereotypes and narratives that are harmful to the Black community or the Asian community or communities of color? And I would say that journey inward, it's like a maturing process. And I believe a lot of times when we talk about spiritual formation or discipleship, we don't include race in there, but we do have a racial formation as we grow up. Would you all agree? And you can shake your head, nod your heads. We have a racial formation that we develop as we grow up. And it is part of our spiritual formation to undo narratives that are harmful to all of God's image bearers. And so it's just a constant work for me. I will never arrive, but it is not linear. It's cyclical in a lot of ways, but I'm adding more tools as I go on this journey of racial justice and racial reconciliation.
I'd like to share, I recently listened to Pastor Tope Keloso. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but he said we must go beyond the integration or to accept, must go beyond toleration to love, beyond native culture to kingdom culture, live authentically. And I think that is very true. And to me, we cannot change one day, just let's do this and that. And the small act of kindness and love every day. You know, when somebody smiles at me and I love that smile, accepting who I am. You don't have to be just looking, turn the face, but smile, and you don't have to talk. That's kind of little kindness, acknowledging other human being as if you are also loved, and also other human being, accepting other human being with love. And I think that small things, if we live with that, I think this is going to go a little better world than we are facing. Just a little.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. I just got a question from Lawrence Rogers that I think is an interesting an interesting question to end on. And also, a real quick note, Dr. Taylor would like the panelists to remain online after the meeting for a debriefing session. So for the panelists, just to stay on after we're finished. Okay, all right, final question, and then I'll turn it over to Byron. Thank you, Lawrence. How can Asian Americans contribute to challenging racism and colonialism systematically? If there is any privilege, particular for Northeastern Asians, how can it be used to challenge racism?
Really good question, Lawrence. Of course you would ask something like that. Knowing you. Yuri Kochiyama stood alongside Malcolm X and used her voice to fight against the oppression of Black folks, right? And Asian Americans can stand alongside, like we've been trying to, like there's this resonance throughout everything we've been sharing. It's like admitting our complicity, knowing our stories, and also standing alongside and using our voices and using them loudly and proudly. And that's a struggle here, right? Because if we don't know our stories, then you know we're sometimes play into the role of being that model minority, and we don't even know like our position or situation in this whole sociopolitical stuff. And so, but I think that using our voices and using them loudly, and going on these marches, or at least using the platforms that we are given. The white adjacency or honorary white, that's very complicated. Not always do we have that role. And like Christine mentioned, it's the switch, right? There are very few, if any, Asian Americans in positions of power. But with that being said, I think loudly making noise and flipping tables.
Flipping tables. That's all. That's awesome. I see Stephen Moore just shaking his head out there. Thank you all so much for attending this, what I believe and what has been said already, the first Asian American panel ever, or not ever, but at least as far as I can tell. So thank you all for sharing your trauma, for your vulnerability, and thank you all to the audience for joining us. And I will now pass it back to Dr. Taylor.
Doc's gonna pass it back to me. So I'll take us out. Everyone, I want to just thank all the panelists so much. And Michael, thank you for your help in gathering and the leadership of everybody. This was extremely powerful. And I mean, it's the first one I've experienced where we've had Asian Americans leading the conversation about race and racism, especially in our church bodies. And we need this, right? We need to see all these perspectives at the table unpacking these things. And we're gonna have more conversations. So I want to remind everybody that 1 o'clock, so you have an hour to go get lunch, right? And you have an hour to get back here on your screen so that we can make it to our next session, which is White Too Long, the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. That's at 1 o'clock, and we want you to make it back for that. But I always like to give folks something to think about at lunch during our time away, something to meditate on and reflect on. Something that was said that I think is extremely powerful is about our spiritual formation and how we've been formed as people. And that formation sometimes and often doesn't have the appropriate or healthy input. And so we have to go in and examine our formation. And we have to be critical and have a critical consciousness surrounding our formation so that we can really unpack how we're complicit. Because if we're all true with ourselves and if we're all confessional with ourselves, we have participated in white supremacy as much as we've worked to dismantle it. And if we can go in and be confessional with ourselves, we can do the heart work, not just the hard work, but the heart work to unpack where we are still complicit inside that work. And so at lunch, what I want us to do is just to write down our confession. Maybe we need to take some time and write down our confession about how we've been participating in white supremacy. And I think that's going to be important, especially as we get ready to move into the rest of our day together. We need to be confessional. Confession does a couple of things. It keeps us from running too far into guilt, but also it keeps us from running away from the truth. And so confession has a real sincere place, especially in our Christian movement and in our Christian work, right? I know so many Church of Christ folks on here, we remember the five finger exercise, right? Hear, believe, confess. But we're going to concentrate on that confession part at lunch. Write it down and unpack it, maybe with folks that you're having lunch with. And we're going to come back and really continue to dig deep into this analysis of white supremacy and how it's affecting our Christian community and what's going on there. So we'll see you at 1 o'clock. Panelists, please stay on so that we can do some unpacking, debriefing with you real quick, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone at 1 o'clock.